Okay. Welcome to the Regional Futures Conference 2025. It's the first year of our rebranding. Colleagues might remember that this used to be called the Winter Conference until we realised that many of our members across the world were not experiencing winter, and we decided to have a rebrand. So we are now the first year of our Regional Futures Conference. It's the first day of our conference, but we've already done quite a bit of RSA business. So yesterday, the Women's Network met here in the Cumberland Hotel, discussing the role of women in regional studies and the Academy. If anybody would like to get involved in that network, please see a member of staff. By all accounts, it was a really productive conversation. Last night, we had our 60th anniversary dinner, celebrating 60 years of regional studies, where there was an opportunity to look back on all the things that we've done, the success and how much we've changed as an association, but also looking forward to the future. How can we listen, connect, respond to the wishes of our members, and how can that shape our values and aspirations going forward? Yesterday, we also had our Regional Studies Association board meeting, where we signed off our future strategy, which is due to be launched January next year. That strategy has been developed in consultation with our members and people with key portfolios on the Regional Studies Board and in our community, and we're really excited about sharing that with you. So please look out for that, and we hope to engage you in that dialogue at the start of next year. So have a wonderful next couple of days. We've got a fantastic plenary to start the session. And I'm going to pass over now to our chair, Louisa Corrado, Deputy Editor of Spatial Economic Analysis. Louisa, over to you.
So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here today. We are marking today 20 years since Spatial Economic Analysis was launched by Bernard Fingledon at the University of Cambridge. I'm happy actually to see here today also our colleague Martin, who actually was also collaborating with us at the time. The journal then further flourished with Paul Hellhorst and Ugo Fratesi, who is here in the audience, with representatives of our editorial board and co-editors. Now it's 20 years, it's a long time. Maybe some of the young researchers that are here today were at the primary school at the time, so time is really goes by fast. So what is special about spatial economic analysis? Well, we have quite a diverse editorial board, which includes not only specialists in spatial econometrics, but also economic theorists, economic geographers, and applied economists. So reflecting this breadth, as the name suggests, the journal is advancing not only spatial econometrics, but also spatial economics, and is empirically expanding into areas such as network econometrics, big data analytics, network and regional modeling. As such, we actually welcome submissions also from this conference of papers that cover such expanding areas of interest. Now, to celebrate the anniversary, we have commissioned a special issue that pairs big questions at SEA. For example, the relationship between regional growth and innovation, cities and institutions, trade and data flows, spatial inequality, and that pair these big questions with such modern toolkits. We have invited a small group of notable scholars in core areas and asked them where research should go next. And the aim is, on one side, to state what spatial economic analysis was established originally for, and also to guide future submissions, sustaining the high impact factor of the journal. Now, today's speaker will pick up these themes and point to the next frontiers. The first speaker is well known, is Professor André Rodriguez Pous, who holds the Princesa de Asturias Chair and is Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics, where he also directs the Cañada Blanche Center. A former head of LSE, Department of Geography and Environment, he recently chaired the EU high-level group on the future of cohesion policy. Professor Poe's research spans regional growth and inequality, decentralization, institutions, discontent and populism, among others. And his work has profoundly influenced both scholars and policymakers worldwide. He is consistently ranked among the most cited researchers globally in urban and regional studies. Among many honors, he has received the European Regional Studies Association Prize in Regional Science and the Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award. Joining him is Dr. Rachel Franklin, the Executive Director of Harvard's Center for Geographic Analysis, a role she took on earlier this year. She brings over 2 decades of expertise in geographic information systems, spatial analysis, and quantitative methods. Before joining Harvard, Dr. Franklin was professor of geographical analysis at Newcastle University, where she also led the Newcastle data. She serves as group leader for livability at the Alan Turing Institute and holds visiting positions at the Gran Sasso Science Institute and Brown University. Her work is bridging spatial data science and urban policy, making her one of the leading voices in understanding how technology and demography interact across places. Now, what is the format of this session? We have the 2 presentations, 20 minutes each, and at the end, there will be 30 minutes for question and answer. So let me first introduce Professor Andrés Rodríguez Pos, who is presenting his paper, When Size Really Doesn't Matter, from Megacity Meets to Place Sensitive Prosperity. Thanks.
Okay. I'm just going to put my timer to make sure that I'm on time. Thank you very much, Luisa, for the introduction. Thank you very much to the Regional Studies Association. I think that there's one small detail. You had a fantastic presentation of my CV, but I think the most important detail here is that I was awarded this year the Sir Peter Hall Award, for which I'm really, really grateful to the Regional Studies Association. After all, Sir Peter Hall has been the hero for many, many of us, and was one of the founding fathers, if not the founding father of, if we are here, it's because we followed his work and we're honoring his memory, and I'm really proud to have received this award. I'm also grateful to the Regional Studies Association for the invitation, but also to Spatial Economic Analysis, through the editors, both Ugo Fratesi and Luisa Corrado, for having invited me to discuss a topic that I've been actually thinking about for quite some time, but I was never forced or pushed to actually do any work on it, which is why does size really matter, and why size in the end? When I'm talking about size, I mean about urban size, the size of our cities. Does it make having bigger cities our lives better? Does it make us more prosperous? And according to the agglomeration orthodoxy that has dominated mainly within economics, the way we think about things in recent years, size matters through 2 mechanisms. The first one would be agglomeration, so how big your city is, but also the whole density. So what we have had over time has been, for the last 3 decades, this powerful consensus emerging from fundamentally new economic geography and urban economics, in which the new economic geography, the Krugman, the Fujita, the Venables, plus all the successors, equate that if you have bigger cities, then you're going to grow. And this has been compounded later on by the emergence of urban economics, mainly epitomized around Ed Glaeser at Harvard, the idea that it's density, when you have not just big cities, but dense cities where people can interact, can exchange ideas, then you're going to get significant economic growth, and that has shaped policy consensus from Washington to Beijing for the best of 2 decades. And now I think the pinnacle was when the World Bank published its World Development Report in 2009, reshaping economic geography, and many people here in the room, especially the geographers, were critical of it, and to a large extent rightly critical of it, highlighting the idea that if you limit density, if you limit diversity, you're going to undermine productivity, and you're going to undermine growth and therefore well-being of cities. And also that there's a consensus that that's what they say, that if you increase the size or you double the size of your city, then you will increase productivity significantly. So put a big city in your life, and it would be the best recipe since sliced bread. But the problem is that one thing is theory, and then when it meets reality. And reality goes in all directions, and it's really, really messy. And what we have, so if density, if agglomeration, if size was density, then we would have the most dynamic cities in dense places. London is big, but it's not very dense. Lagos is much bigger, and it's much denser. Yet, Lagos by no means rivals London today in terms of competition. Cairo cannot, which is probably 10 times, if not more, bigger than Copenhagen, cannot compete with Copenhagen. Kinshasa cannot actually emulate Zurich in many ways. Many of the densest cities in the world are in Latin America, and yet many Latin American cities are struggling to actually deliver. And there has been some sort of counter-revolution in that respect, coming from people doing regional studies and regional science, highlighting that sometimes this idea that bigger is better doesn't work. Bloom and others, already in 2008, pointed to the idea that there's no empirical evidence of a causal effect of urban population share on economic growth. Work that I did already some time ago with Susanne Frick showed us that for us, the biggest impact on economic growth worldwide was found between cities of 1 to 3 million, and smaller cities actually did not deliver as much, but also bigger cities were not as dynamic. And Louis Dijkstra, Enrique Garcilaso, and Phil McCann, who was sitting at the back with a big cup of coffee, already highlighted that in the European EU15, since the 2000s, economic dynamism has shifted away sometimes from big cities. We have dynamic cities in Europe, but we also have some large cities that are not doing very well. So the evidence is mixed. For every London, for every Warsaw, for every Madrid, you have a Rome, you have a Berlin, which has only become dynamic recently. You have a Lisbon, you have a Vienna that have performed much worse. And of course, here the evidence is also mixed when you start looking at where growth is being generated. Tom Kemeny here, sitting at the front with Michael Storper, has published quite a lot for the case of the US, and he has been highlighting that, yes, superstar cities actually make a difference, and they're pulling ahead, but they do represent, in the case of the top 25 superstar cities in the US, 41% of GDP and 32% of population. But beyond those superstar cities, you have the rest, and many of them very large cities that show significant convergence with areas that are less dynamic. And you have in the US smaller places that have shown considerable dynamism, and as a result of that, they have grown. It's not that it goes in one direction, it can go in both directions. Again, Enrique Garcilaso and Joaquim Oliveira, when they did their analysis of the OECD, they found that 73% of growth in the OECD happens outside the biggest regions. And Phil McCann, as well, has found that for the UK, 2/3 of large cities are actually not overperforming. They're lagging behind. Many big cities in the UK, including the second largest agglomeration like Birmingham, are underperforming, and they have been performing significantly. And of course, in many parts of the developing world, there's increasing evidence that this is not working. Golling et al., Jedwag, in different times, they have highlighted that these are becoming consumption cities more than production cities, and as a result, the performance is not as good as strong. So what I should have said is that in many ways, the orthodoxy is based on three assumptions, which I would call, more than assumptions, I would call beliefs. One that may or may not work, and I think it probably works, but with a lot of caveats, which is that bigger is better and bigger cities always grow faster, which is what I said, yeah, it might be the case, but it's not always the case. But then two other assumptions that I think never work, which is that if you concentrate your economic growth in one place, if you make your cake bigger, using Brexit terms, then this is going to spill over to the rest of the country and is going to diffuse. So if you're going to do policy, you might as well invest, if you're Ghana, in Accra, and then performance in Accra is going to spread over to the rest of the country. The second one is that people will always migrate to where there's opportunity. And that, as I said in my paper, The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter, that there has been for some time the idea that you should get on your bike, and if you have no opportunity in Hartlepool, or if you have no opportunity in Liverpool, then get on your bike and move to London. But of course, there are significant barriers, and that not always happens. The one is about spillovers, the first one. The idea is, if you have a rising tide, all boats would rise. Is that the case? Well, this figure about trickle-down economics, which was pointed to me by Evelyn van Leuven, shows what I think is really happening. So they're telling us this is how it works. You just pour your wine on your top city, it makes the magic, and then the wine spills over and goes to your smaller towns and regions. In reality, what actually happens is you start pouring all your resources into your big city, and your big city gets bigger, the rest actually do not catch up. And there's a lot of evidence that highlights that whereas in terms of urban growth, big cities have significant backwash effects that can be felt for, in some cases, up to 1,000 kilometers, in other cases, up to 1,000 miles. When you go to spread effects, they are much more restricted, and you have strong distance decay effects. So if you are in Paris, you can suck resources from the rest of France and from many parts of Europe. You're lucky if you get any sort of positive effects if you are in Poitiers, which is just 200 kilometers away from Paris. And this has been shown in many other analyses. So Ben Faber, for example, highlighting the whole expansion of the high-speed rail network in China, has highlighted that in the end, this mainly you connect peripheral regions to make core regions stronger and bigger. And of course, Ron Martin here with Ben Gardiner has been highlighting that there's a clear evidence of significant decline of sort of impact with distance from London. The further you are from London, the more you suffer. And then, of course, then you have Ha-Yun Chang highlighting that once you realize that trickle-down economics, and for him it doesn't work like for me, or it works much less than the idea of backwash economics, if you want to put it like that. The idea is that you realize that this is a policy in the end to promote already dynamic cities without any sort of benefit in the less developed cities. Then there's the migration mirage and what happens with the migration mirage. So the idea that people will move to opportunity, and people are moving to opportunity, and it's desirable that people move to where they can develop most of their potential. But we also have a situation whereby many of us either cannot move or don't want to move. And I am a migrant, so I shouldn't be saying that, but the idea is that there's a lot of talent that is in places that are less dynamic that is being wasted because these people either don't want to move, and they might not want to move because they got their social networks, their family, their lives, they enjoy being where they are, and they can contribute, and they feel they can contribute to where they live. But also because they might not move, they might be pull factors, but there might be, or push, and there might be also factors that repel them from moving. What is, let's say, a high school graduate from Kansas going to do in the Silicon Valley? What are the opportunities? What is someone moving from Carlisle to London? Where is this person going to live? Especially if you, by selling your house in Carlisle, well, or in Middlesbrough, you get very, very little, and with the money you get, you can buy a cupboard somewhere in London. So that's one of the issues that has to be highlighted, that migration remains highly specially selective by level of education, as Tom Kemeny and Michael Storper has shown for the case of the US, that there are still, people have deep roots, and moving is actually costly, and then especially within the developed world, we're moving far less than our parents and our grandparents did before. So we have now the second automatic stabilizer that also doesn't work and is actually quite dysfunctional. And then on top of that, they are the hidden cost of concentration. The people coming from the new economic geography and the urban economics have been telling us that, of course, yes, when you have agglomeration, you're going to have a lot of positive externalities, but you're going to have some negative externalities. Congestion, pollution, and high rents. And of course, these are important negative externalities. I'm not going to belittle them. But when they do the analysis, and their theoretical analysis, as my friend Gilles Duranton would say, we can still put the whole population of the world in one city, and that would make the positive externalities far greater than the negative externalities. For me, the problem is that it's not that they are overlooked, they are highlighting externalities that are wrong. I think these are negative externalities that are important, but they are also overlooking some externalities, negative externalities, that are as important, if not more important. One is the whole idea that territorial inequality has significant costs. Phil McCann has been highlighting, for the case of the UK for quite some time, the significant costs of a country that has become far more unequal in recent years, like the UK, than it was in the past. I've been trumpeting the whole idea that the geography of discontent has significant cost, and we are seeing this in this country. Brexit, which was to a large extent, although there were a lot of other factors, triggered by the reality and the perception, both of them, of neglect in many parts of the country, and neglect that led to large, long-term, almost secular structural decline in many parts, triggered Brexit, that led to the decline of places that were already declining, but the people there already knew that they were declining, so for them there was no change. It led to the relative decline of places like London, in comparison to other comparable cities, where we thought we were never going to decline, at least over the last 30 years. And, of course, Ron here has highlighted that London had declined significantly before the 1990s, and the whole idea that, as a result of that, the whole of the UK is doing worse. So that project fear was actually project reality. So we're doing worse than we should have been doing before. And then, of course, you have the social costs and the institutional weaknesses that it all generates. And, sorry for quoting myself here, in The Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter already wrote that the real cost so far has not come from congestion or high rents, although they are cost, but from the social and economic distress and problems that this process is generating in many less agglomerated areas. And the question then is, what really matters? What I would say, what matters is what you put in your city. Know how big your city is. Is the ecosystem of a scale. You can grow and be dynamic in a city the size of Singapore, as you can see here, but you can grow and be very dynamic in a city the size of Tallinn, which is less than 500,000 inhabitants. And in between, you have very dynamic cities, very innovative cities, high productivity cities like Zurich, Helsinki, and the like. It's not size, but it's sophistication, it's how you combine your human capital, your institutions, your infrastructure, your specialization. There might be a lot of talent, and I'm sure there's a lot of talent in Lagos, but the problem there is that the institutional environment is actually quite weak. You need complex systems that adapt. You need, as Ron has been highlighting, Ron Bosma in this case, a lot of interconnections and build on what you have and create production functions. But size may play a role in that, but not necessarily the fundamental role. Big cities may matter, may growth, but only if the context is favorable. There's a reason why New York is New York, and I don't know, Kinshasa is Kinshasa in that respect. Institutions made the clinical difference. So you might have very similar density and different outcomes. The density in Copenhagen and in Cairo, if you put the whole agglomeration, is not that different, but the difference is fundamental institutional capacity. And also what you'll have is that very often centralized government, top-down decision-making may be a burden that might undermine, might end up creating economic development in certain places. Fundamentally, those places close to power, Paris, and not in the rest of the country. There are alternative models that work. My friend and colleague and former chairperson of the Regional Studies Association, Neil Lee, has highlighted it very, very clearly in his recent book, Innovation for the Masses, in which places like Germany and the Mittelstand, South Korea, Denmark, Switzerland, sometimes with agglomeration, sometimes with less agglomerations and more, they end up with more balanced systems that actually spread economic dynamism to all, albeit in the case of South Korea, there has been a tendency to concentrate more recently. And so what we need to go is towards, I was going to say I put a new policy paradigm, but the paradigm is not so new. We have been fighting, those of us on the place-sensitive or place-based sort of approach, the idea for the bottom-up local development, local economic development, for quite some time, the idea that you need to concentrate your resources in a few places. And we need to perhaps make sure, as Ron was saying yesterday in his speech to the gala dinner of the 60th anniversary, to build on what we already have. We need place sensitive, not necessarily to be doing exactly the same, but to start and diversify to related sectors and to make activities more complex, to mobilize the potential that we have in virtually every place and to transform and reinvent those places from what can make a difference, not from pipe dreams. Like, for example, Peter Hall was highlighting that the problem is most development strategies fail because they are overambitious and they try to create economic development out of things that cannot be rooted in territory. We have to improve institutional capacity, improve the governance, the rule of law, reduce corruption, increase trust. We have to generate real connections. There has been a lot of work coming from Norway, Rune Fidjar, from Sweden, Marcus Grillich, for example, from the teams of geographers like David Dulaure or Richard Shermer in Canada, highlighting how connectivity can very often create and recreate and creating systems, the agglomeration issues. And you need to invest in human capital. And very often, although it's not a golden bullet for this, decentralization allows for tailoring development strategies much more to the local conditions. So, since I'm running out of time, I'm just going to finish with the key messages. Size and density would probably matter much less than we have been told. The stabilizers and the traditional automatic stabilizers, spillovers and migration, are, in my view, definitely broken, and the real negative externalities have not been factored in. The social and political costs that lead to economic costs need to be factored into the analysis to have a real analysis of what's happening. And we can get success at every single scale. Of course, if you have very small regions, might not work, but what we are being fed is a false choice between equity and efficiency. Equity leads to efficiency. Efficiency, if done well, as we have seen, leads normally to greater equity. So probably there's time to abandon the city fetish. And I'm going to skip this one, just what this one's. So we have a choice right now. And I think I'm preaching to the converted to a certain extent, but we need to go, as Ron was saying yesterday, to talk to people that are not converted, because we have really now an essential choice between a sustainable model, and what I believe is a sustainable model that unlocks the potential of all places into a more harmonious, but also more durable, more resilient, and more sustainable economic development for all, inclusive development, as Neil Lee has been highlighting, versus what has been and is proving increasingly an unsustainable model that breeds inequality and resentment, which in the end leads to lower growth, lower productivity, and lower prosperity. The choice is yours, so I would encourage you to go out and preach the idea that with the methods and the analysis that we can do, we can make a better world by promoting growth for all people wherever they live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, for your excellent and thoughtful analysis of the mythology surrounding megacity superiority. So now the next speaker is Rachel Franklin from Harvard University. She's presenting her paper, Old, New, Borrowed and Blue, the best 21st century spatial economic analysis tools for the job. Very keen to hear her findings, also to direct future submissions to the journal. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Just waiting for my slides to come up. I worked hard on this title and on my slides. No. It's good. It builds something. My timer doesn't start until my title slide comes up. Okay. This is me. As I said, I worked hard on this. Hopefully, by the time I get to the end of my slides, of which there are 31 for 20 minutes, you'll understand more where I'm coming from. So what this really is a talk about what we talk about when we talk about spatial economic analysis. And I think this is really a question that holds for all of us, because it's a question about how we know what we know, right? What kinds of questions do we ask, whether we're quantitative researchers or not? What kinds of questions do we ask, and how do we go about answering those questions? And how have we done it in the past relative to how should we maybe think about doing it in the future, right? So I don't know if you can see the bottom, but it says I've built this as a talk that hopefully has something for everyone, not just the people who would call themselves spatial economic analysts. I'm not even sure that I fall into this category, which became clear as I did this research. Okay, so what do we mean by spatial? Here I think we have a definition and a set of ideas that probably hold across all of regional studies, probably all of geography, all of regional science, right? Thinking about roles of location or place, thinking about geographical variation and disparities. We've just had a great talk about this, right? Whether we're talking about cities or regions or countries. Thinking about context, what's happening around a person, around a firm, around a city, around a household, right? Spillovers, interactions, networks, all of these are spatial concepts, and they all play into all of our research in very different ways. A lot of times, though, this spatial piece, it's also what you might think of as like a statistical artifact. And I think that this is relevant for some of us in the room and a little bit less for others. If you don't work with statistics, you're maybe less worried about isolating that spatial component in your model and dealing with it appropriately. Okay, what do we mean by economic? Here, I think the tent starts to get just a little bit smaller, and I think I've probably missed some ideas, so I'd be really curious what else should go on this list. But it's obviously issues, topics like economic growth, economic development. I was thinking it's also like if you do work with models, you've got whatever you've got on the left-hand side of your equation, economic growth, but then we study all kinds of things that go on the other side of the equation, the other side of the model. That can be a really wide variety of topics and issues, right? But it's definitely thinking about the roles of different economic sectors, thinking about firms, innovation, entrepreneurship, and also, I think it's really important to acknowledge this. I think about well-being and quality of life and human capital. It's about actually making sure that people are living lives that feel fulfilled and that we're all thriving. That, I think, is really what the economic analysis is about at its root. And then when we get down to analysis, here I think we get pretty narrow, right? So analysis comes in lots of flavors, right? It could be case studies, empirical work. I think it can be just descriptive analysis, whether statistical or otherwise. It could be spatial analytical or geocomputational, speaking more as a geographer. And it includes machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques. Or, if we're talking about spatial economic analysis, it could be this marriage of spatial economics and economic geography. I call this the spatial economic analysis flavor. So this is fairly econometrics orientated. And if you're not a very quantitative person, you might be thinking this is all the same thing. Right? But actually, to those of us who are like in the weeds and dealing with data and dealing with models, it turns out there are a lot of different communities, and we're not all talking to each other, perhaps in the ways that we should be talking to each other. And that's probably the main takeaway from this. Okay, so another way, and I'll try and be quick so that I can get to the actual analysis part of my analysis talk, but another way of thinking about analysis, if we're thinking about marriage, is to think about old things, new things, borrowed things, and what I just called blue things because it made the title sound really great. In English, there's an adage about weddings that every wedding should bring to it something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. That's where this comes from, if you're not familiar with the phrase. Okay, so another way of thinking about would be old stuff. And here I'm really focusing on methods, right? So old methods. And you can decide what your starting date is for this, right? But definitely input-output, CGE models, shift-share analysis, which I remain super fond of, even in 2025, location quotients, which never fail to motivate students when they finally grasp like what you're actually trying to do with a very simple technique, spatial interaction and gravity models, spatial autocorrelation and regression, right? So I would call these old, not in the sense of being old and out of fashion, but like they've been around for a long time and they really perhaps form the core of what we do in spatial economic analysis, right? Then we have newer, right? So we have sort of Bayesian approaches, which I put into its own category, but Bayesian sort of infiltrates everything. It's a completely different way of thinking about models. Instrumental variables, geographically weighted regression, spatial econometrics, algorithms, neural networks, clustering, microsimulation. These are all not cutting edge. They've been around for a long time, but they are newer techniques in spatial economic analysis, right? Borrowed. Okay, I called these your PhD students spatial economic analysis tools, right? This is machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches, right? So thinking about natural language models, thinking about large language models, computer vision, which is how we extract features from landscapes automatically. Like if you think about Google Street View, like we know if we look at Google Street View that we have opinions about what kind of neighborhood we're seeing. It turns out the computer can pull all of that from lots and lots and lots of street views for us and tell us where are the trees, where are the cars, where are the houses. This is super, super, super powerful because of the scalability of the analysis, right? Foundation models. Where I'm heading is, I don't understand why we're not seeing more of this in spatial economic analysis. That's another takeaway. Okay, so then we have blue, best linear unbiased estimator, if anyone was wondering where that came from in the title. This is just ordinary least squares. I don't have much to say about it besides it's old school. I wanted to say it's like your grandmother's spatial economic analysis technique, but it's not. It's like vanilla cake, which is a completely different metaphor, but it's like the technique that all of us probably were exposed to at some point. It remains like the bread and butter of a lot of statistical analysis for very good reasons. All right. Okay, so if those are all of the ways, and this is a little bit muddy, like these are not hard boundaries, these are fuzzy boundaries Techniques can belong to more than one category, probably. What do we think about spatial economic analysis? What is it, and how has it evolved over time? And we have a great way of just seeing, like, revealed preference, like, what are we actually writing about and publishing on? So we could look at spatial economic analysis, which is, as you've probably gathered by now, been around for just about 20 years. It's got lots of papers published, over 400, and I think it's a pretty good proxy for what we consider to be spatial economic analysis. And if it's not, then I challenge us to think about, like, why do we have a gap between what we think is spatial economic analysis and what we're publishing in a flagship journal that calls itself Spatial Economic Analysis? I think this is really, really relevant. Okay. If you're not familiar with bibliometric analysis or topic modeling, you could do this with a qualitative approach, and people do it all the time. When you interview somebody and then you use NVivo, for example, to extract the information from an interview, topic modeling is very similar, except that you can do it in sort of we call it supervised or unsupervised fashion, right? Supervised is like NVivo. You know what words and phrases you want to pull out of the text, right? Unsupervised, you let the computer decide what is it that people are writing about. Our approach is a little bit different because we've automated this. We don't have to ask the computer to find stuff for us. We put all of the text in and ask it what emerges from all of this. Our corpus is all SEA papers, with the exception of virtual special issue papers and issue editorials. All right, so what does a machine think spatial economic analysis is? And how has this changed over the last 20 years? This is just one machine, by the way, so it's like one human. I think this is really important because sometimes when we talk about quantitative analysis, it is as if we think we're speaking some truth that other people haven't found. If you've played with ChatGPT or Gemini, you know you get a different answer every single time. The machine is also variable. So this is what one machine thinks about spatial economic analysis. And I apologize that you're really just probably going to see, even the words are sort of small, and you probably can't make this out. It's too bad, because it's a very nice graph. Okay, this is about topics. So what do people write about? So not the methods, but just like the kinds of things that people write about in spatial economic analysis. The main takeaway, and in a way it's good if you can't read the words, the main takeaway is that there is not a lot of change over time. What we started publishing in like the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, is still, to a pretty large extent, what we publish on now, right? And a lot of it is agglomeration, it's trade, it's migration. I'm trying to think if there's anything that's really declined over time. Even I have to look at this. But basically, the main topics that you think will be in there are in there. And then there are some that are sort of always constant in the background. I have to say 20 years and 400 papers in the grand scheme of things isn't as much as we might like to really pull out some signal with one machine. Okay. This is the methods, right? And the main takeaway here is, again, we don't see anything that sort of starts high and then declines over time. We also don't see something that starts low and then starts to increase regularly over time. We get a lot of ups and downs, which we might expect given that it's 20 years, but it's only like 400 papers, right? So all it takes is a special issue in 1 year on spatial econometrics, and spatial econometrics is going to increase because we just don't have a lot at the base. But that said, what we can really say is that there's an awful lot of classic econometrics and spatial econometrics and spatial economic analysis. Input, output, still around, started maybe a little bit higher in the early 2000s, but it's still there, sort of low, like constant thrumming in the background, right? What we don't see, and what I sort of expected to see, was that for machine learning and AI, we would see something low and then gradually increasing. That was like my hypothesis going into doing this analysis. It turns out the very first issue of spatial economic analysis had a paper with neural networks from Roberto Patuelli. So actually, these methods, as geographers like to say, these methods have largely been around for a really long time. It's just that we're talking about them more now in geography. All right, so main takeaways. We don't see a lot of change over time. What we see is a lot of the same. This reinforces it. What you really want to look at here is the classic econometrics and the spatial econometrics. And every year, they make up a fairly large proportion. And in general, there's not a lot changing over time. Oh, I'm going to be really on time. I can slow down. All right. I was planning to just flash this on the screen. I'll spend 30 seconds more on it, which is just to say, on the left, we have methods, and on the right, we have topics. And you might think that when you're seeing these ebbs and flows that, topics and methods, they tend to go together really closely. But it turns out that like the spatial econometricians, they're working on everything. For most of these topics, classic econometrics, spatial econometrics, they're actually working on almost all of the topics that are identified in spatial economic analysis. So it's not that by focusing on a particular topic or on a particular method that we narrow things any more narrowly than they already are. Okay, so closing thoughts. Left behind methods. Okay, so this is how it started. This is just a word cloud of the main words that that emerge in terms of methods in 2006. If you look at this, it is a lot of statistical words, right? Fixed, presumably from something like fixed effects, likelihood, we get GMM in there, we get variables, we get equilibrium, all words that trigger me in terms of like econometrics and econometric analysis. 2025, what we get is more or less the same thing. And I'll show you at the very end, all of them. Matrix is like right there, like in the middle in so many years. Like, this is very much a spatial econometrics journal to a very large extent. So we get words like distance, we still get variable, we get squares. But if you look at the words like autocorrelation, we're getting a lot of econometrics and spatial. So I was thinking, like, what do I think about all of this, and what do I think it means for the future? And in the paper, I think of spatial economic analysis sort of like a union versus intersection, right? So it's like a Venn diagram problem. We think when we talk about spatial plus economic plus analysis, it should be the largest tent you could possibly imagine. That's the union approach. It's interdisciplinary by definition. It encompasses all of these approaches. So in theory, we should be an incredibly vibrant community. And I'm not trying to suggest that we're not vibrant at all. I just think there's potential for more vibrancy, right? Because I think what we actually do is work very much in the intersection, and possibly the intersection of all three, which means it's a very small group of people who use the specific set of methods, the specific definitions of economic, and the specific definitions of spatial, right? So we have the potential to be really big, but in fact, we're a little bit narrower than we could be. Okay, so here's a question for the audience. What do we think about academic fashions and methods and topics? Because what this is showing is that spatial economic analysts are fairly robust to fashion, I think is a takeaway, right? And we've had lots of fashions. Like as somebody who's sat a lot in regional science, for example, and has been in places where I'm working with economists day in and day out, the two-stage least squares instrumental variables thing was very much a fashion. Like, there was a period where you could not have an instrument, right? And we're seeing that fade. And when I talk to economists, I say, the thing I find super cool is that it's all difference and difference now. Difference and difference is the fashion that we're living in sort of economic analysis. So these fashions, they come and they go. SEA, Spatial Economic Analysis and Regional Studies Association, appear to be immune to this, right? And when senior people, and I'm thinking more of geography, when senior people in quantitative geography write about quantitative geography, and especially new methods and new data, what they often say is, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This has all been done before. If only they would read whatever was written 3 decades ago. We don't need to do this in this way because it's already been done. And I think that there is a lot of validity to an argument like that. Don't reinvent the wheel. But what do we do when the vehicle doesn't change its wheels, right? Because I think we could also agree that that's not great. I assume that in every country you also rotate your tires from time to time, right? It's not that you need to get entirely new tires, but you might just put them in different positions in the car, and like the car might drive a little bit better. I think that's a great metaphor, and I think that we should hold on to that. And this is not about substitution. This is about complementarity. This is about embracing that interdisciplinarity, and that interdisciplinarity has to do with methods and not only sort of the questions that we're asking. Okay. A tag along to this, because I am not I'm not a cutting edge methods person. If you know me well, you know that about me. What I really am interested in is data. And the thing is, in order to work with a lot of these new forms of data, you need the new methods because the data are really big and they're really complicated and they're often unstructured. And so the methods come along with the data. And so my sort of surprise and like the sort of lack of strong signal in terms of machine learning, data science, artificial intelligence is just that I think it reflects like there just aren't as many new methods in spatial economic analysis as I might have expected to see. And I'm a big critic of a lot of these data, but they do things that we weren't able to do before, and they are now, for better or for worse, part of the mix in terms of how we do our analysis, right? And this is all kinds of data. We often refer to them as new and emerging forms of data. So web scraping, crowdsourcing of data, GPS coordinates, like mobility data, mobile phone data, satellite imagery, street view imagery. Where are these approaches in spatial economic analysis? All right. So, last slide. Evolution's a survival mechanism, right? The only thing that's constant is change. I'm trying really hard to make sure that I don't get up on a stage and say, I think that this is a problem, but I do think that there is so much potential, better to frame it that way. There's so much potential for making sure that that tent in spatial economic analysis is as big as possible. And this is important for Regional Studies Association, it's important for the journal, but it's also really, really important for the research that we do because we would like to ask interesting, fun, impactful questions and do it in a way that gives us answers that we're fairly confident in. That's the end. And here's the word cloud.
Thank you, Rachel, for your presentation. Actually, we asked our contributors where SEA should go next, and you gave us deep insights on where we should go next. So now we are taking questions from the audience. I propose a batch of 3 questions for each speaker. So let's start from André. So 3 questions for André, and then we move to Rachel, and maybe André, either you can respond, there, or you can come here. Yes, please. The first, yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, Jodie Willett from the University of Exeter. First of all, thank you so much for that. It was really great and really affirming, especially when research around pooling and concentrating population in large megacities has been so dominant for such a long time. I was just wondering that given that in the UK in particular, but not only in the UK, but given that 80 to 85% of the land mass in the UK is rural, I was wondering whether you could just sort of speak a little bit beyond urban areas, and I was wondering how rural areas figure into this for you.
Second question, Ron?
Just wait for the microphone so people can hear you.
Thanks very much. Ron Holt, University of Cambridge. Enjoyed both talks very much indeed, so thank you a lot for stimulating our thoughts on those topics. A couple of things for Andres. Do you not think perhaps we might go back to the literature, which is some years ago now, which was most influential at the time, it's been decried since, the idea of the optimal city size. Is there a size of city in the sense that actually you reap the benefits without, in a sense, the disbenefits arising from diseconomies, etc., many of which you mentioned. And on trickle down, I just wonder, Doreen Massey wrote about this some years ago and how it's utter nonsense, but it actually has been quite pervasive. So it might be worth going back to her papers. I wrote something on the Beware of Agglomeration back in 2008, so this has been around some time. And a very final point, in terms of city size and growth, if you actually read a lot of that spatial economics literature, it's not really about growth, it's about productivity. And if you double the size of a city, you get about between 5 and 7% increase in productivity, which is minimal. So the whole idea of actually doubling a size of a city to get a big size for productivity itself is questionable. Just a quick question, if I may, for Rachel. I just wonder whether you feel that a lot of the spatial econometrics is really about refining technique for technique's sake. And that one of the problems with a lot of that work, and I do it myself to some extent, is in fact it's very, very difficult to embed context and local context within these sort of big models, these spatial econometric models. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with first two questions to Andres, and then we move, if we have time, to others.
Okay, thank you very much. The two questions. The first one about rural areas and the role of rural areas, etc. I didn't mention, my talk was mainly about cities, but when I put the emphasis normally on intermediate cities, small cities, towns, and rural areas, because I think that across most of the world, you can find potential virtually everywhere. And new ideas can emerge with or without agglomeration, although interacting with people and proximity makes a big difference. And I'm going to try to highlight two areas or two types of literature that I think are important to highlight how rural areas are making a difference. The first one is that when you start looking in Europe at where has innovation come from. And of course, there's a lot of innovation that has come from big cities and intermediate cities. But in recent times, it's funny that some of the most dynamic firms in high and medium tech not necessarily come from the huge innovation hubs. They don't come from the Parises or the Londons of this world. They come from relatively small, remote areas. So the two examples that I would like to highlight is fundamentally the biggest company in the world in furniture production, which is IKEA, that actually emerged from Sweden, but not from Gothenburg or Malmö or Stockholm. It came from a place called Umshult. And forgive Rickard my pronunciation of Swedish, but which has probably around 8,000 inhabitants now. By the time Ingvar Kemper founded it, it was about 2,500 inhabitants, so really rural and remote in the southern part of Sweden. The largest apparel company in the world, although it might have been surpassed in recent months, which is Inditex, Spanish, not from Madrid or from Barcelona, but from Arteixo, which is a suburb of a relatively sleepy, declining city where otherwise declining, it's not declining because of IKEA, where my family comes from, which is A Coruña. So you can find a lot of potential. And this is something that has been highlighted by the literature that's looking at connectivity. Why in places like remote areas of Norway or remote areas of Sweden or not very dynamic and relatively remote and isolated areas of Quebec, you still find considerable innovation, which on per capita terms does not envy anything that's happening in the big cities. It's mainly because, as Richard Shermer and David Dulure and Marcus Grillich and Rune Fitcher have highlighted, they are capable to substitute the lack of face-to-face interaction through connectivity. And the idea that they might generate better type of connectivity with firms, with economic actors, with social actors that might be nearby but sometimes located in other parts of the world because they use the right type of connectivity. When I go to the senior common room at the LSE, according to most of the literature, I should be talking about things that would give me new ideas for research. And sometimes talking to colleagues gives me new ideas for research. But most of my talk, depending on the season, and now because we have more international people, was about football, much less about cricket right now, and sometimes about rugby. How does that impact my productivity? Well, most of the time, the impact is rather limited. Although I might think one day about doing a paper about football and concentration of talent. When a relatively rural, remote firm has to engage in connectivity at a distance, it does it with a purpose. So you substitute the something's in the air for nothing's in the air, and then you go forward in that respect. Ron's questions, and very quickly, optimal city size, I would caution about that. I'm not a fan of finding thresholds. And I thought that was a an interesting literature, but that was fundamentally us social scientists trying to please ourselves and find what is their actual threshold, but I think it's the real world is utterly irrelevant. I would push for trying to explain what makes any place, rural, small town, small city, medium-sized city, large city, superstar mega cities, more dynamic than what it is. And you're right when we're talking about the literature coming from urban economics and spatial economic analysis is fundamentally about productivity. But I just came from a conference in which I had a massive amount of economists talking about the problem of productivity, and the whole idea is we need productivity for growth. That was the whole idea, so that's the connection there. And of course I should go back to Doreen Massey, whom I admired and I still admire and respect enormously, but I must say I haven't read her work now for a rather a long time, since I was a student and in my first years as a lecturer. But
this is a problem, the citation half-life is so short.
I completely agree with you, and I think we should sometimes, and I think Rachel has gone, go back to the people that have shaped how we think, and then not just to be doing exactly the same, but to adapt and change and help our discipline and our research to change.
Thanks. Yeah. Sorry, before, there is another question for, so we have a batch of 2 by 2 for Rachel.
Rachel. Phil?
No, he has a question for you.
Oh.
He's waiting. He's chomping at the bit to ask you a question.
I know, but I think he was for you. He raised the hand for you.
Yeah, there is one, sorry, yes.
So I'm Yael Alval from the Technion. I'm an architecture and urban historian, and I really related to aspects of your talk where you identified, fashion or context, where I heard culture. So I was wondering, how does space and its cultural implications and the methods and the kind of data that is embedded in it can play out in expanding, I don't know, the tent, and in considering the ways in which other communities talk about these things in different kind of ways, may overlap and maybe transcend this discussion on spatial economics together with spatial and cultural types of analysis.
Okay, yes, you can go on, so you can respond. Both questions. So round and...
Okay. I just want to make a quick point, if I may, about the city size piece as a sort of demographer, which is that the only way cities are really going to grow these days is through migration. And a key piece of this discussion is that these people come from somewhere and those areas get hollowed out. This is a spatial problem, that everywhere is connected to everywhere else. And so if we want to talk about how cities are going to do well, we're increasingly going to have to talk about what we're going to do with the areas that have lost all of their people. And I think there's a lot of room for conversation that ties these networks together of destination, but also origin, what's happening to these places when people are leaving. Okay, so spatial econometrics. What I think about spatial economic analysis is that in many ways it has become a spatial econometrics journal. And I don't know that that is necessarily a problem, in the sense that methodologists need to have somewhere to publish. And I've just come off of 8 years of editing Geographical Analysis, which is the geography methods journal, and we have exactly the same issues. That what we get increasingly are papers where they've fine-tuned sort of just a little bit the model. They often give it a brand new name, right? And so it just drives you crazy, because now you have to find reviewers, and if it's spatial econometrics, it's not like it's a massive number of people. Some of them aren't talking to each other anymore. Like it just becomes a thing. And as editor, you're really frustrated. On the other hand, if you're a brand new person coming out with your PhD now and you work a little bit on methods, what on earth are you supposed to do in order to get cited, right? So I think these things are more tied together. Like health of disciplines is tied to journals, is tied to methods. And so I'm not sure how to solve the problem, because these people need to publish somewhere. In an ideal world, spatial economic analysis would be a much broader tent than that. And I think still analysis, it's just, I should also have disclosed that I'm a geographer, and I don't think that spatial economic analysis is a geographer's journal. It's an economist's journal or something that isn't really geographers. And I do think if you're talking about Regional Studies Association, that's definitely a problem. And it's a problem that you see in regional science. It's a problem that you see in a lot of these sort of regional institutions. And so you might think that this doesn't matter for you, but actually it matters for you even if you're not publishing in this journal. And I wish that I had a clear solution to it, because I think maybe we just need a methods journal. Maybe everyone needs to have a methods journal, and maybe we need to spend time on that. And we need to publish more in spatial economic analysis. And I was I think I can say what we need to do, because I was co-editor for a while, very short while, but a while. I think the thing is that once you publish something, that's a signal to other people that this is the thing that gets published. So you've got a lot of path dependency of what ends up getting published in a journal. And so somehow we need to, I think, make sure we get enough papers out in spatial economic analysis that all of the people who could be publishing in the journal look at the journal and say, I could publish there. Culture. Sure. I mean, I think culture matters in a couple of different ways. One, it's one of the ways that we think about the economic, right? And so I think it matters in terms of the research that we do. Local characteristics, and that includes culture, they matter for all sorts of outcomes, right? This is a piece of what Andres was talking about, and it matters for every kind of place, so not just cities. But it also matters for the kinds of questions that we want to ask. So in different parts of the world, the questions really should be different kinds of questions. Actually, we want that, right? Because it lends diversity. This is how we get new ideas, right? The world becomes our senior common room, and we see how other parts of the world think about well-being, and we think, oh, maybe those ideas of well-being, they also hold for the place where I do my work, even though that's not how we ask the question. So we need that kind of fertility, because it gives us new ideas. And I think it should affect also the kinds of data that we're working with. The only caveat that I would issue is that what we see a lot of times between sort of global north, and in particular North America and the UK versus everywhere else, is that we have access to different kinds of data. We have access to more compute, which means we can ask the bigger questions and answer the bigger questions. And so there is a little bit of equity of access in terms of data and methods, and actually like the computational capacity that everyone around the world needs to be able to have. So just because we don't see big data happening in some countries, it doesn't mean that the interest isn't there. It means that the infrastructure's not there, right? And I think that's an important thing to think about. It may not be culture, it might just actually be economics.
Actually, with satellite remote sensing now, actually, even for countries that traditionally have no big data, like social networks, you can still probably fill the gap.
I think I disagree. Now, with satellite imagery, as a person who, I see Martina out there, as somebody who works a lot with imagery, no, what it means is that we in the UK and the US can now work with everyone else's place. That's what satellite imagery means. It doesn't mean that if you're in that country that you get to work with those data. Imagery are incredibly massive. Like, they're huge in file size, and you need a lot of expertise to work with imagery. It just means that we get to do the research for other places, and we might call it partnership.
We get information. No, the point was, to get more information.
Yeah, but what we want are those places to be asking the questions about their own places. Otherwise,
with right tools. Okay, questions from the audience for Andres.
Hi, Philip McCann, University of Manchester. On the question of scale, the way that Andres, obviously, as you know, Andres, I agree with almost everything you've said, and we've written on these things together, but one of the people who has the strongest views on these things in terms of a proponent of the argument that you're characterizing Glaser urban economists is Michael Storper. And Michael Storper is the protegeus of Peter Hall. And we saw this in the summer. And he's pushed back against the OECD people, and they're finding that quite difficult. So I just wonder, given that Storper is much more eclectic, he's not an urban economist by thinking, why would he have these positions?
Sandra, do you want to answer? One, yeah, Bachelor 1 now. Bachelor 1. So you use more.
Phil, you got the wrong person to answer that question. You should ask Michael Storper, because I'm a close personal friend of Michael, and we talk about these things, and sometimes I agree with him, and sometimes I disagree with him. And I think that even on this, it's one day he says one thing, the other day he says another thing, which is not necessarily contradictory, but it goes in all directions in that respect. And there's no criticism on Michael. We all say different things. But I think the right person to ask is Michael, because, of course, there's a lot of evidence and that big superstar cities are very often very dynamic, and they should be dynamic and they should be promoted. But the problem is what happens to big superstar cities in the medium and long run when your hinterlands decide to vote for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump and his ilk perpetuate themselves in office. And there the problem is that when you look at averages, the more you go to the extremes, the greater the likelihood that you have is of lower levels of growth. I can put the two examples. The link between populisms and economic development and economic growth that has been done by Trebisch and Funke, Trebisch and Schulerich in the American Economic Review, that they find that after 12 years, after 10 years, 15 years, you get 12% less growth. I've been doing similar work at regional level in Europe with Louis Dijkstra and Chiara Dorati, and we say they don't need to govern. Just going to the extremes leads to lower and significant levels. So over 12 years, we find that it leads to, in places where they haven't governed, 4% less economic growth, lower employment at levels of 3%, and similar declines in productivity. On top, there's a significant impact that I publish in Research Policy on research output and innovation. And the problem is that once you start voting for these extremes to vent your anger, you might never go back. Tell that to the people in Hungary, tell that to the people in Turkey, tell that, and I'm sorry to say that, to the people in Italy. When I was living in Italy in 1993, when they elected the original populist, now we think it's a nice guy, Silvio Berlusconi, he's dead, etc. But since then, with a very, very small interlude and 3 technical governments, the Italians have gone from one populist to a more extreme populist to an even more extreme populist. And the result has been 30 years of absolute stagnation.
Yeah, another question?
I have a question for Andres. Stefania Fiorentino, University of Cambridge. So, Andres, you talked about size and cities and overemphasis on cities, superstar cities. I agree with all of it. I just think maybe there's a specific discussion we should have about how there has been for decades an overemphasis within policy on agglomeration. So actually it's not necessarily cities are the result of that, but before cities and Jacob's externalities, related varieties, it was industrial districts, so not necessarily cities, but still agglomerations in place-based policy. So maybe that's actually something we should discuss a little bit more, how we created that by having an overemphasis towards creating growth, productivity, innovation through agglomerations. Is there another path, a different one, that recognizes different places and the differences between different places, and therefore also something else beyond superstar cities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Stefania. And there's a bit of echoes. I'm getting difficulties of hearing the questions from the back, but I hope I can deal with that. As I said, I mean, the title is why size doesn't matter, and because in the end the conclusion is not how big your city is. I do think that agglomeration economies might matter, but they are marginal there are other factors that are far more relevant. It's what you put in your city. The type of human capital you attract, the role of institutions and the quality of institutions, the capacity of your firms and of your managers to actually reach out to others, the accessibility of your city, the diversity of your city, for me, are far more fundamental factors. And of course, there's another path. I don't remember who said that, but it was said that in order to have something that's viable is where you get the maximum access to essential services like health and education and, for example, justice that works, etc., rule of law, with the smallest size. And then you end up with quite a few cities, not just in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world that fulfill those requisites. Cities in Switzerland, with the exception of Zurich, are actually quite small, but they are very dynamic cities and very nice places to live. I forgot to mention when I was asked about rural areas, the whole Mittelstand in Switzerland and the south of Germany. There you have a completely different model of innovation and growth that is fundamentally connected to small cities, rural areas where you'll get much more inclusive growth that leads to the generation of hidden champions, and hidden champions also generate more benefits for the population. And on top of that, you have access to public services and basic services that are, and amenities that are world-class in that respect. So I think there's another path to economic growth. I'm not against saying let's promote a more dynamic Tokyo. And we need to make sure that many of the big mega cities in most of the developing world that are not working very well, that are not functioning, start functioning much better. But that's not the only way. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that if you expect that by promoting your big cities, you're going to create dynamism elsewhere, you can forget about it. You need to make sure that investment is not, and any sort of policy is not by definition or by stealth policies for already dynamic places, but policies for almost every place where we can make the most and get the biggest returns.
Thanks. So are you thinking about a sort of, how do you evaluate how successful are these place-based policies? For example, would you think about applying the philosophy of the OECD with a better life index applied to cities, where not just growth and productivity matters, but also inclusion, and work-life balance? They have, certain domains, that are non-economic, and then may be built for, like, to measure city level quality of life. Yeah. What is because the point is to measure the success of the policy-based.
I think one of the problems that, for example, the European cohesion policy has had since smart specialization, which is, for me, a great invention because it does lead, with all the problems it has had, to actually try to analyze how can we mobilize the potential of every place, with more or less successful, but it was. But the problem was that they blurred the objectives. Yeah. The objectives was more or less every region decided what were the objectives. And I think that having growth, having employment, having productivity, there's the basic economic objectives. It's important and they should be kept. It doesn't mean that we should limit ourselves to those. Perfect. Measuring, I've been working quite a lot on quality of life, and measuring quality of life and well-being, I think is another way, which is very often complementary.
Great, thank you so much. I think we are almost, one final question, and then I have to close. Okay.
Is Heike Mayer here? Yeah. Hi, I'd like to recognize Heike as the existing president of the Regional Status Association, and I will be assuming her job in the new year. And on behalf of her, she has done a wonderful job in bringing people together, identifying groups, to giving people a chance to negotiate and create new experiences in their career. So on behalf of Katie, we I'm fair game. So if you want to
Okay. Any final question for Rachel from the audience? Yeah?
I did have one very quick point.
Yes.
You mentioned Glaser. I think his best paper actually is the one on the reinvention of Boston. And I think that's highly relevant because if you look at most big cities, London's a classic case, it's reinvented itself about 3 times over the last 200 years. And arguably, and indeed New York faces the same problem at the current time, you know, it's dipped in its attractiveness to labor, its growth rate has fallen off. But is it reinventing itself, for example, around AI, life sciences, and so on? Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question here, I think, about taking a longer-term view about how these big cities do go periods of slow growth, which arguably we're in now, as you pointed out, but they have the power and the concentration of power and elites to be able to reinvent themselves in a way that perhaps smaller places aren't. But at the same time, many of the smaller, fast-growing cities are, in a sense, inventing themselves. So it's an interesting sort of long-term evolutionary take on this, I think, which might be worth exploring.
Want to say something, Rachel, on that, or should I?
I thought that was a question for you.
Okay, so fine, just very briefly. I think you're right. We need to invest to make sure that places reinvent themselves. And big cities are reinventing themselves, and many, as you highlighted clearly, Ron, many small and medium-sized cities are reinventing themselves. The only problem we have at the moment is that for big cities, because of the narrative and how it goes, we are allowing them to reinvent themselves because we're investing in them. When we look at, that's one of the problems, and when you're trying to analyze where money is being invested, for the European Union money, which represents 0.3% of GDP in the European Union, we know exactly where every euro has been invested. When you look at most countries in the developed world, when you look at national money, and in Europe that represents about 45% on average of GDP, we don't know, we know how it has been invested, but we don't know where. In some places where you can do it, like the UK, you find the funny thing that the region receiving the highest amount of public expenditure is not this one, it's Northern Ireland, for obvious political reasons. The second one is London. So we are investing a lot in already dynamic places in order to help them invent themselves. The problem is when it comes to saying we're going to level up, and then you put peanuts in many parts of the north, and then when it comes to cutting investment, you cut it there. You're not giving them a chance, and that's where resentment comes in, and where the negative externalities that might prevent London from reinventing itself might come from.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we can keep the conversation over coffee. So many thanks to both André and Rachel for their excellent presentation today. So thank you all for coming to the plenary. I invite you to submit your papers to Spatial Economic Analysis on all the areas that Rachel also has highlighted. Thanks, everyone.